I would like to welcome all of you to the live episode recording of 100 Historic Black Women You Should Know by Election Day. So we're here to celebrate number 63. If you've missed any of the past episodes, we're counting down 100 all the way down to Election Day, and we're on number 63, which is Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. So we're here for the live recording to basically celebrate the release of her memoir. And if you haven't gotten it yet, it is this beautiful, lovely book that I have been reading nonstop all of today to prepare for today's recording. So like I said, please pick it up. If you're new here, I am Shay Omanijo, also known as Shay the Historian online, if you guys see me there. And this podcast is very simple to make sure that Black women are no longer the footnotes or treated as footnotes throughout history. So that's why every single day we're highlighting a historic Black woman. So I'm going to give a little bio of Justice Jackson, and then I'll introduce our wonderful panel members for today's episode, which I'm so excited about because I just realized that we're all super connected in a way that we didn't even know until recently, which is like phenomenal, right? Okay, so let's go ahead with her bio. So Ketanji Brown Jackson was born in Washington, D.C., and grew up in Miami, Florida. She received her undergraduate and law degrees, both with honors from Harvard University, then served as a law clerk for 3 federal judges, including Associate Justice Stephen G. Breyer of the Supreme Court of the United States. Jackson subsequently practiced law in the private sector, served as an assistant federal public defender, and worked as a staff attorney and later as vice chair of the U.S. Sentencing Commission. In 2012, President Barack Obama nominated Jackson to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, elevated to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit in 2021. Jackson made history in 2022 when President Biden nominated her as an Associate Justice, the first Black woman ever appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. She took her seat on June 30th, 2022. What a phenomenal bio. And it's also in the back cover of this beautiful book. I mean, look at this. I mean, we can honestly get into the profile and photography for this book because it's truly phenomenal. And let's do the introductions for our guests for today. So today I am joined by 2 esteemed guests, both Harvard Law graduates. See, one thing about Black women that I really love is we're going to show up for our own, especially because of these type of spaces where there's just so few of us. I'm just so happy to be in conversation with them. So I will start with Imelme. So Imelme is an appellate public defender in Detroit. Prior to becoming a public defender, Imelme clerked for Justice Sonia Sotomayor on the Supreme Court of the United States and for Judge Robert L. Wilkins on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. During law school, she served as president of the Harvard Law Review, becoming the first Black woman to hold the position in the journal's 131-year history. Drop the mic right there. Kristin Turner is our next guest for today's episode. Kristin Turner is a thought leader and strategist aiming to rethink our political and social change storytelling. Across industries, she's known for her work centered on creating more equity, individual agency, and overall well-being in the world, and for giving shape to the conversations that support that. Her perspectives generally live at the intersection of social change, civic tech, and electoral politics, with a current focus on nonpartisan political persuasion, digital storytelling, and the underexamined relationship between individual change and collective action. Kristin is the founder of MisfitMinds Collective, a civic studio and lab on a mission to reimagine our relationships to ourselves, each other, and the world around us. She previously served as the National Director of Ballot Access and Voter Protection on the Warren for President campaign, and as the Deputy Director of the Super PAC affiliated with Emily's List, Women Vote. Wow, what a phenomenal group of women to be with here today. So I thought it would be really great to start this podcast episode actually talking about a passage from Ketanji Brown Jackson's memoir. And I think it will really just set the tone for a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss today. So I will read this beautiful passage, and let me actually provide it for everyone as I read it out loud. There we go. So for many Americans, this is Ketanji Brown Jackson, for many Americans, the appointment of a Black woman to the Supreme Court for the first time since this country was founded was extraordinary and long overdue. I marveled at how different this moment in our nation's history looked compared to eras past, such as when Plessy had been decided, or when the very court I was now joining had stated in its 1857 Dred Scott versus Sanford opinion that African Americans were beings of an inferior order, so inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. That's from the opinion. 165 years later, the media carried the occasion of my swearing in widely as breaking news, a refutation of past ignominies, a long anticipated and highly celebrated national achievement. And this is from the beginning passage of Justice Jackson's memoirs. And it's a striking scene. And I think it's something that really prepares the reader for the depths that are going to be covered in her memoir. So I just want to start off with your reaction to this quote. What message do you think Justice Jackson is trying to send through this memoir, with starting with such a striking scene and comparison of what it means for her to take such a powerful position? And I'll leave it to
Sure. Yeah, no, first of all, Shay, thank you so much. This is very much an honor, and I really admire your project. I love when you said Black women no longer being the footnotes in history. That's a really beautiful way to put it. And I think that this quote gives me chills and makes me think about things like that, because you can certainly read this and appreciate it, that she is certainly not going to be a footnote. And I love, what I love about this quote is I think it shows that it's not lost on her how momentous and important of a step this is, albeit long overdue. And I think that's really important, because I think it also, even though it's a reflection in many ways, it shows how she might be thinking about her role now and the importance of continuing going forward, right? And understanding that she is really, like, has taken up the mantle of such important, being in such an important institution, and she understands that, the gravity of that, and I really love that, and I think that it makes me happy to know that there's someone on the court that sees herself, is able to situate herself in this history so well.
So well said.
Hi, so I want to echo the many thanks for being here. This is a great concept, like, just even as we couple it with the momentum and the trajectory of where we're heading in November, I think it's so great to uplift the context writ large. And I think that's very much so what Imelme was talking about. And also what struck me is I think that, we are coming out of a moment where we see what happens when we have leaders who do not contextualize their roles and also our roles in the world. And so I think to open with someone who can self-situate in a way gives me a lot of hope. And I think also opening with a reflection and a sense of humility, in the sense that we are talking about the highest court in the land and arguably one of their worst decisions, and the idea that you can step into a role that can get it wrong sometimes, and recognizing that this is not an imperfect position, I think is huge. And I think that signals to me a level of not only humility but humanity that I think that we're all really kind of reaching for. And then I also think that, like, the thing that we're all pointing to and really relishing in is the fact that change is possible, and it's nowhere near impossible, even if it comes too few and too far between. And so she really captures all of those things, I think, really eloquently in just a few short words.
I really love what I think both of you guys are touching on, which is the fact that just because this is a memoir written by a Black woman doesn't mean it can't appeal to everyone. There's a certain level of humility and humanity that I've found just from reading, a couple hundred pages so far, is that in reality, what Justice Jackson represents for everyone is advancement across the board. You know what I mean? Like Justice Jackson taking that seat isn't just a matter of, okay, well, I'm here and, forget everyone else. What we see so far is like, wow, like this is a step forward for all of humanity, because for the longest time throughout history, we've seen that Black women are often the least considered, least understood, least prioritized within history. And by all means by the court, which we'll definitely get more into that. But I want to talk about you guys, because I think you guys have such a beautiful perspective to add to a lot of the narrative that we're going to see in Ketanji Brown Jackson's memoir. So I think it's really good to start off with this, because it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. I think people are very interested in the experiences of being a Black woman at Harvard Law. So I was wondering if you guys could both share one significant challenge you had while you were at Harvard Law, and then one happy memory, because I think oftentimes whenever we talk about Black women and their stories, it can be very easy to focus on the challenge and not also at the same time focus on the good times, because there can be good times even in spaces like this. So Imelme, I'll start with you. One challenge and one really good memory from your time at Harvard Law.
Yeah, sure. I think it's smart to ask for both, because yes, law school is it's a very intense 3 years, and it's kind of started with a unusually intense first year. And so when you ask about what's the most challenging, and when I think about what the most challenging time in law school, I think I do go back to that first year, and not just because it was a lot of reading and a lot of class hours, but also it's a lot of that stuff on subjects that are totally foreign. And I've never before law school heard of a tort, never thought about all the intricacies and procedures about filing a lawsuit, or how to litigate a case, never thought about like the intricacies of a contract or anything like that. And I think it does relate to the question with respect to race, for that there's a very good chance that among Black women, certainly Black students and Black women, that is uniquely true and disproportionately true. That I don't come from, neither of my parents were lawyers. And so I think it's not just a new environment, a lot of work, but also on subject matter that is very, very difficult. And certainly as it starts out, and you can get the hang of it eventually, but I think the foreignness of it is a bit jarring at the start. But I also, like, my happiest moments also come from 1L year, because it's where I met two of my very best friends, and who I've remained very close with and talk to regularly, and I love and admire and aspire to be more like. And I think that's important because I met them during that chaotic time. So I think it's important to remember that even in these challenging moments, and I even in these challenging moments, you can look up and there are good people around you. And that was certainly true at HLS. That there are people that, like, and I certainly was a beneficiary of finding two in my section that really can carry you along the way, and not just in my section. Kristin was certainly a leader on campus and someone I deeply admired, not being funny, but there are these moments in these kind of challenging and chaotic spaces where you can look up and kind of grab inspiration to keep you going a little longer.
Oh, I love that. Kristin, how about you?
I echo everything Memoir said for sure. And we were fortunate enough to be there. We overlapped. So that was great. We got to meet and know each other while there, which just added to the sense of community. The hardest thing, definitely, 1L, obviously people talk about it. And I think to echo Memoir, it's like there's there's the foreignness to the language. And I mean, I remember subject matter jurisdiction took me forever to just be able to say,
Mhm.
like, the cadence of it for first year. It was just like, why? But even more so than that, to your point, there was a lot of self-doubt.
Mm.
And constantly there was a lot of self-coaching that was required, and I think that like that gets left out sometimes in the narrative because like you have to have something that combats the self-doubt that does creep in. And I think that when you layer it on top of the stamina game that you're playing, because you're just constantly reading and like the ritual of it becomes a little bit redundant and it becomes, very exhausting, it becomes easier to have louder negative voices in your mind.
Yes,
um
agreed. Mm.
to varying degrees, but nonetheless, like they can creep in more than you're usually, used to, especially in the context of the fact that, like, if you've gotten into any school at Harvard, you know what I mean? Like, you have essentially worked your butt off. You know what I mean? Like, there's no way that you have not earned that spot, but it's essentially like going to a summer camp where suddenly everybody plays your same position, right? And so, like, you're no longer the, outstanding student. It's like the playing field feels much more level in some ways. In other ways, it feels like the generational wealth version. But we won't talk about
Yeah.
that right now. But like there's another, so there are different things, and you're trying to just get your arms around it. And so like that space before you can name it requires a little bit of grappling. So I think that's tough. And then I think personally for me, in my arc at HLS, actually my hardest year was actually my last year when
Okay.
I was in student leadership, and I was also kind of going through my own journey of really deciding what I wanted to do after law school, and really having to kind of like interrogate, kind of like what my current experience was and what I wanted my future experiences to be. And I really felt like that was particularly difficult as a student of color, as a woman of color, and kind of weighing and trying to assess what my responsibilities were to myself and to other people that I was both related to, knew, and didn't know, just by virtue of me being in that position, and trying to figure out how you balance that space between like the highest level of legitimacy and the least amount of responsibility that I had had so
Mm.
far, and
Mm.
figuring out what I was supposed to do with that was really, really hard. And I felt, and I still feel like there was a gap in terms of the conversation and in terms of the way that this institution could support that conversation. And so that's where I try to fill in now, as being like, there's always a third option or a fourth option or a fifth option. And I think leaving space for imagination was something that I really craved while I was at HLS. So that was kind of like the harder part. And then the happier part, I mean, definitely community. I
Yeah.
have actually one really happy memory with Imelme that she probably doesn't know. That's actually the year after I graduated.
Oh.
So the year after I graduated, they opened the AFAM Museum here, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and there was like a Black lawyers HLS dinner thing there, and Imelme had just become the first Black woman president of Harvard Law Review. And so Ted Wells is one of the members of the Harvard Corporation the board, and also just a very well-known Black alumni who's very involved, et cetera. He works at Paul Weiss. And I'd worked with him when I was president of Balsa, and he's like, "Where's this girl? Like, have you seen her?" And I was like, "Oh, I was like, "No, not only have I seen her, she's here." And he was like, "What? But find her, no, bring her to me." And I was like, "Done, say less." And I went and I find a baby, and I'm like, "Baby, somebody wants to meet you, Ted. Really wants to meet you, right?" And I
Yeah.
introduced them. And it was one of those things where you're talking about one of the most high-powered attorneys in this country, lit up in a way that was just so special when he met Imelme. And it was one of those things where it really illustrated the fact that your inspiration can come from behind you,
Yeah.
and the fact that your inspiration can come at any age.
Yeah.
Um, and it was really special for me to see that, and to see her get her flowers at the same time. And so that is actually one of my happiest memories. And I think about it when I see it. So I was like, I love that day. That was a good one. So that's what I'll say.
I love that so much, and I think that is truly the beauty of being at Harvard is these different type of communities that you not necessarily have to form out of necessity, but that you form out of a deep desire to actually want to see each other succeed.
Mhm.
Even though I'm just across the lawn from you guys in the history department, I think that's one thing I had to learn really quickly is that I truly just enjoy being around these people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I truly enjoy seeing my peers thrive. And I think at a place like Harvard, where you just assume it's very cutthroat, you know, everyone's out for themselves. And there's a subgroup like that, you know, don't get me wrong. But what I've noticed, especially about the Black community, especially with my best friend, is wow, like we are so generous with our flowers. We are so generous with our support. We are so generous with connecting one another. Cause that's another thing. Harvard can be a very isolating period of
Totally.
life if you don't have that community, if you don't have those intentional connections. And you know, it just warms my heart hearing stories like that, because it's like, nah, like we don't have to be isolated. Not everything has to be a competition. Like we can truly love and desire to see other
Totally.
people flourish, you know?
And it's wild because I think that, you know, I think I remember having this conversation with Balsa Balsa is the Black Law Students Association, our little like Black students group on campus. And, you know, I think one of the most disorienting things about that time is the fact that it's so peculiar that it's hard to assign language to sometimes. Like it's very insulated, it's very
Yes.
specific, it's very niche. And so you're suddenly in this, you're kind of thrust into this context where it's like, it's hard to describe your life to the people that know you the best in terms of like your family and your friends. And so
Yes.
even creates some weird space. And so it's so helpful to be able to have community in that space with people who like, you know what you're seeing and what you're experiencing and some of the stuff that you even haven't even expressed. And so I think that that is the benefit of not only like the Balsa experience inside the law school, but like this inter kind of like school situation with
Yes.
the Black grad space at Harvard generally, because it is very
Yes.
hard to describe at times.
Mm, very well said. Okay. So, you know, now that we have some, well, I'm still in the Harvard bubble, but now that you guys have had some space away from the Harvard law experience, I'm interested in how Justice Jackson's trajectory from Harvard Law School to now the Supreme Court of the United States informed your own journey, your own trajectory. Because I think oftentimes with memoirs, this is a genre that I read, you know, this is probably the top genre I read.
Mhm.
Memoirs are oftentimes written after a very huge event or at the end of
Mhm.
somebody's life. And I think
Mhm.
there's some lessons that can only be learned in the middle of what you're going through. And not necessarily, you know, once you achieve that big goal that you set for yourself or you achieve that position that you want to get. So how has her trajectory going once again from Harvard Law to Supreme Court informed your own trajectory and how you see your career moving forward?
Yeah, sure. I really love this question because it gets to one of my favorite things about Justice Jackson, and that's that I think as impressive, you know, she's had an incredibly impressive career trajectory, but when you know, when you look at it, and it's not even a but, it's an and, when you look at it, it indicates that she wasn't always like following this type of playbook to end up
Yeah.
you know, on the Supreme Court, you know, in particular, you know, because of my bias, I think it's always worth mentioning that and emphasizing that she was a public defender. And and I just think that it, you know, becoming a public defender is not something you're going to do if you're hell bent on becoming a federal judge, or, you know, certainly not on becoming, you know, Supreme Court justice. And she did it anyways. And she thought, you know, she said she thought it was worth doing. It's a worthy cause, and it's important work, and I'm going to do it. And I just think I really admire the fact that I really admire that about her story. And it, of course, and she still had the trajectory she had, and she still ended up a judge. But you know, I think that was more of a gamble to take, but um, rooted in understanding, rooted in her convictions, right? And,
Mm.
you know, I think, not to be too much of a groupie, but I think Kristin's another really good example of that. I think you can really get stuck on, I went to HLS, so I need to do this type of thing after, and then I need to go to this firm for this amount of time, and then I need to do, there's like this kind of eerily subscribed to playbook that people can just fall into it and kind of might lack imagination, or even not just imagination, but it being a good fit for you. And it's one of the things I, you know, admire about Kristin. I think looking up and getting on a campaign and looking at realizing that there are problems more on a more fundamental level about how we interact with one another, and as you know, civic participants,
Yeah.
and being creative about that. That's not, if you're wedded to that law school, the HLS playbook, you're not going to do things like that, and you're not going to really follow that type of passion. And I think Justice Jackson, although it's like, might see, oh, I mean, and she ended up on the Supreme Court, yeah, but not by some like super like, I need to do this, that, then I need to be a prosecutor, and then I need to be, in whatever. She didn't do that, and I really admire that, and I try to remind myself of that, and being kind of courageous, and what my next steps might be.
Because one day, y'all, we'll be reading Imelme's memoir.
I know.
I'll be like, look at it. Isn't it beautiful?
Hopefully it's just as thick.
Right.
Exactly. I feel exactly the same about Justice Jackson. And she came one year, I think my final year, your second year.
Yeah, she did.
Somewhere around there.
Yes.
Yes, she came. And it's funny that you asked the question, because it actually does play a part in my story. Because not only did she's very open about it. She's kind of like, I was just like, this kind of felt right next. And then I did this next thing that, so it was that piece of it. But then she was one of only two people total that also talked about the fact that she actually deliberately like squeezed in space in between each of her jobs. And I'd never heard anybody from HLS say anything like that ever. She was like, oh no,
that
like,
is not in the playbook.
it's just not a thing. Like, that's not like, it is prescribed. And then they're like, well, it's a silver platter, so why wouldn't you? What you mean, baby? Like, that's pretty much the vibe. And so she was just like, no, like, I take a second to breathe. And it was just both a nonchalance with which she said it, and kind of like a matter of fact in terms of like, I am a person, and I kind of want to like take a second because I work hard. And it was just like this acknowledgement of her being a person and a being, amidst like the things that she does inside of the law, that I thought was just really refreshing, and very empowered in a way that I think that like, HLS gets this wrap around kind of like the intellectual power and like the ability to kind of like manipulate thinking and thoughts, but it's surprising how quickly you can lose sight of yourself in a context like that, and kind of like lose hold of your ability to keep hold of you, inside of all the things that you're grappling with. And so I thought that was really powerful for her to come and be like, I take time in between, and I don't necessarily plan it out like 5 years in advance. I just kind of see what makes sense next. And to follow your most immediate curiosity, to me, just felt very inspired, particularly for in like, in a Black culture that's very much so like, go with what is safe and sure, and so it just felt subversive, but in a really empowered way.
And okay, so I have a follow-up question, because I think you both raised some really good points. How do we manage societal expectations, whether it's coming from our own community, meaning the Black community, or whether it's coming from the Harvard Law community? There's always this, or just the Harvard community more broadly, there's always these expectations like, okay, you got this really prestigious degree, like, what are you gonna do next? Or, you represent an aspiration within the Black community, what are you going to do next, right? So how do you balance those expectations with your own internal goals? Because I think sometimes they can be aligned. We can have goals that, the Black community or the Harvard community, or whatever community may be that's looking up to us, may say, yes, this is in alignment. And sometimes they may be different, like it doesn't necessarily always line up. So how do you balance those two forces?
Totally. I keep on kicking it to a main man. One where she's gonna be like, "Can you answer?"
No, I think it's such a good question, and I think it's a tricky one too. And I think, it's one thing that I think about a lot in terms of my every decision, all big decisions, life decisions, career decisions, is doing something that I really feel like I'm proud of, I can defend, I'll always be able to defend, and not have any hesitation about having done what I believe, made a decision, or whether it be a job or taking a position that I feel proud of, and is something that I'm eager and excited to defend. And I think that the reason that's important to me is because there might be these expectations that are put on you, but you're going to be the one that's like, yeah, but was that a good decision? And you have to live with the regret, or you have to live with the second guessing. And so I think I think one of the ways to filter those expectations as they come in is to really remember that you have to sit with these decisions and you have to really defend them in 20 years or whenever. And that to me is something that when I think about it that way, I see things a lot more clearly.
Totally. And I mean, I think that similarly was what helped trigger kind of like my kind of like transition when I was coming out of law school. I remember because I was in student leadership, I had to interact with a lot of alumni. And I think it was well timed. We had this thing called Celebration of Black Alumni, which only happens every 5 years, and it happened to happen my last year. And so all these Black alumni came back, and it was really like a quick snapshot of like, you know, where they were, kind of like high school reunion vibes. And I think it was fascinating because you really got to see the full spectrum of like just excellence and accomplishment. Don't get me wrong, for sure. It was the place to be. Like, it was like CBC on like 1,000 for sure.
Yeah.
But conversely, you also saw a lot of alum who were successful definitionally, but also in some ways felt like shadows of themselves, you know, and it's kind of like, you know, you're here, you clearly are successful, you make money, you know, but you are like, you know, on your phone, can't even get off to like do this, you know what I mean? And you're kind of like exhausted and all these things. It just made me wonder, like, is that what we're working toward, you know, especially when people sell you, this is in this context, especially for Harvard, like at one point I had to ask myself what exactly I was buying in terms of the brand, because it got confusing to me, because basically, you know, we got there, and especially in the law school, essentially they'll say that there are like 4 routes that you can take, you know, and then that's pretty much it. It's kind of like, you know, big law, public interest, government, clerking. That's pretty much the situation. And it was confusing to me because I was like, right, but you told me that I was coming out of here with optionality, like that it was really like I could do anything. And so when did that change? You know, and so I think that really is what got confusing for me. And so I think, what else do I want to say on this front? I think that was huge, for sure. And I also think you have to realize, like, after everything that you've done to chart your path and to get where you've gone, and also the things that other people have poured into you, to me, the biggest regret would be to wake up feeling like I'm living somebody else's life. And I think that's kind of how I went about making a lot of my decisions, was like, am I being the person that I was raised to be? And like, am I concerned that, like, basically I'm trying to avoid a midlife crisis, you know, because I didn't want to sit here and pour all this energy and pour all this money just for 20 years down the line to have it all and feel like this isn't even like, who did I build this for? So I think that is what I would say. And like, the societal pressure is one thing, but at the end of the day, if we define what is possible based on what has occurred, like if that is the circumference of our imagination, then we are setting ourselves up to live small lives.
So well
And I
said.
just want that for myself.
Yeah. And I think, and this is going to feed right into my next question, but I really want to emphasize the point that you made, both of you guys made. At the end of the day, will I be able to sleep at night? I think that's a good way to.
If you don't want black to crack, you got to be able to sleep, child. Cortisol, you got to sleep, you got to sleep well. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly. It's like, can I sleep
don't
at
let
night?
them snatch all this beautiful melanin. Like, don't let them do it to you.
Right.
Exactly. And I think that's really the battle that we all have to fight at the end of the day. Is like, yes, people may place all these expectations on us, but at the end of the day, they're not going to be there in our heads at night when we have to, you know, think about every decision and every, you know, action that we took. And I think part of that, and this leads to my next question, is if you were to write a memoir, and you know, you guys are both mid-career right now in your professional lives and everything. If you were to write a memoir, what would the central title and theme be? whether it's a memoir that's focused on a specific event or just a memoir of your life so far, how would you sort of title what you've been through so far?
Okay, so because I believe in being democratic, I will go first because I keep punching it. You go first. You go
For the
first.
win.
Okay. So the like main title for mine, because I have definitely gone on a squiggle, but I think my main title would be Stop Taking Questions. And I think the subheader would be A Life of Conscience and Curiosity.
Yes.
Because I think that so, like we spend so much time building our lives, preparing to field questions from other people based on what their anxieties are.
So good.
We could spend that time instead just pursuing our curiosities. And if you think about a world where like if we all felt like we had empowered imagination, we all felt like we had the latitude to really explore and be, you know, the optic nerves of God or whatever your source is, you know what I mean? Like we would be in a much better situation. Like right now, I think we are almost sometimes victim to a template-based model where it's kind of like, you better be able to predict it. You better just go down this road. And if we have learned anything from COVID in 2020, if not before, but especially since then, it's that like at any given moment, the landscape is subject to change.
Yep.
And I think if the only way to really navigate those times is really being anchored to ourselves and understanding that if we don't have to worry about what comes because we know that we'll be able to navigate it.
Oh, I love that so much. Stop taking questions and what that means and what, you know, how you can be so limited by doing that. That's just I think that's so brilliant. And kind of that's a theme that's also really important to me and kind of goes back to what I was saying about one of the most important things in my day-to-day life and certainly at these kind of big junctures has always been to really make, as I said, make decisions that I'm proud of and I will be able to defend without hesitation. And I think that theme is just so important to me because I know it's almost like a litmus test of sorts because I know when I'm on the brink of maybe not doing that or not, you know, making a choice that I'll feel is something that I'm proud of reporting back. You can kind of viscerally feel it, like you don't have that peace anymore. They're kind of you kind of feel like anxious and unsettled, and not to say that every decision you make, you know, you make it and then you're like, oh, I feel peaceful because it was the right decision. Of course you have, you know, second guessing all the time, but there's a real different quality to decisions that are made that are not authentic and don't feel good and congruent with who you are. And so that I think, and not because I've mastered it by any means, but I think that's something that I really think is important. And so that'll be the theme. Title, I'm never good at titles. I don't know.
I think it's academic in me. You know, we're so used to long titles for everything that we're just like, oh, we always just have a title ready to go.
But you know, the thing is, it makes me think about that, and I still want your title, so I'm buying some time right now. The thing that I'm thinking, so you know, one, it's funny because we think that like following the template is going to like guarantee us something, you know, but it's so interesting to me, like even if you do follow the template, by virtue of being Black women, we're gonna have to be entrepreneurial.
Yes.
Like no matter what space you end up in. And so it's like we forget that that is actually like a key thing. And so I'm like, no, like no matter what you do, you are actually going on an entrepreneurial path. It's about whether or not you're going into a context that other people have deemed to be the space where you should be versus a place where you kind of have to like figure it out and then like report back. So like I always like invite people to think about it that way because I'm like the world is going to ask you to blaze a path, especially at this level where you have access to different things.
Yeah.
So well said. And I think that's something I've really picked up on so far in the memoir is that all throughout the generations that lead up to Justice Jackson, you see a constant nod towards that entrepreneurial bend that Kristin, you just talked about, where in reality, entrepreneurship, when we think about it, we think of startups, we think about, you know, what
Mhm.
entrepreneurship looks like today. But in reality, it's just making something out of nothing.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's saying that, you know, you have parents that grew up in the deep South where they didn't have the same rights that you have today. And you literally had to reinvent what it
Mhm.
meant to make money and to raise a family and to raise children in a society that's constantly moving the goalposts, constantly moving the barriers that's allowing you to move forward. And you know, it's such a beautiful way of thinking about it, because I think a lot of people are, like you guys have both been saying, are afraid of the uncharted path.
Mhm.
They're afraid of you know, veering off course, when in reality, when you really think about it, this country actually relies on Black women's entrepreneurship. Because if they're not charting the path forward, we're seeing this with Kamala Harris, we're seeing this with so many
Mhm.
Black women who are taking up leadership positions in this era. If they don't chart the path forward, I'm not sure who exactly will.
A
Because
lot
it's
of cleanup jobs.
Yep.
exactly.
A lot of cleanup jobs.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say though, because the May like you hit the nail on the head, at least for me in my experience as well, where it's like the piece about like basically your body will start talking to you, you know. And it's funny because we rely so heavily on like empirical data that lives on a page, but like we discount the fact that like that is actually, that sensory information is data as well, you know what I
Yeah.
mean, that we like just casually neglect. But I'm like, no. And like the level of like the way that cortisol interacts with your body, the way that, you know, like people end up having chronic disease and cancer, it's like because you're stressed, or also you can be misaligned, you know. And so I think that like by some kind of divine right, you know, I think Black women intuitively are like led by their gut as well as their mind in a way that it has, it's a marriage that is a lot deeper. And so I feel like we would be remiss to leave that on the table and not also, you know what I mean, like listen to those cues and like, something's not quite right. Or it just, it sounds beautiful. It looks beautiful. It's wrapped on, you know, in perfect wrapping paper, actually, you know, but something about it feels like it might not be mine. And that's okay.
And that's perfectly fine. Oh.
But Aimee, what's your book title, huh?
We're both buying you time.
She's like, I thought you were.
Exactly.
I was
Man.
like, I'm coming back.
I did cop out. Yeah.
That's so funny.
I love that. So my next question is, you know, sort of like a pie in the sky one. But if you could have a private lunch with Justice Jackson, what is one question you would ask her?
That's hard.
It's so hard because it's like, where to start?
I know, right? So it's like, just imagine, you know, you're out at lunch and, you know, obviously, you know, she's probably one of the most busiest people that I can imagine. Or even, you know, you have a situation like me where it's like, I literally run into her at commencement, and it's like, okay, I only have like maybe 5 to 10 minutes max to, you know, ask her a question. Yeah, it's like, what's one question you would ask?
It's funny because like all the like traditional questions pop to your mind, you know, like you're like, how does your expectations and blah, blah. But human to human, with my, you know, kind of cursory understanding of how she is and how she's just so different from a lot of the other kind of like attorneys and lawyers and judges that we interact with, I think I would ask her on her hardest day, the hardest day like of her life where she felt like the lowest, what was her winning argument to herself?
Oh, wow. That's a
I
good
think I
question.
would want to know that.
Mm, mm. And that and I think the reason why I'm having such a gut reaction to that question is we all have something that keeps us going through the highs and lows. And sometimes reminding ourselves of that motivating factor or that element that keeps us going. It's like, man, like, do you keep it on a sticky note? Do you have like a notes app on your phone? Like, you
Yeah.
know, like, you know, because, you know, in many ways, the Supreme Court can feel very opaque. You know what I mean? And it's like, how do we actually, yeah, like get at the root of, wow, I know you see a lot of things, both
Mhm.
inside the Supreme Court and outside of it.
Yeah.
Like, what keeps you going? I love
Mhm.
that. question.
Oh, I love that question. And it's also a great question because it's not just limited to her time, the court. It can really be,
In your life, your lowest
her
moment.
life.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And I think, this question is tough, I think, because as Kristin said, all the like typical questions like come to mind first, and you think like, oh my goodness, like what's it like to be there right now, and all that type of stuff. And I think, but that's important to think about though, because I think she is in a really unique moment of the court's history. And I know everybody always says that, oh, this is unprecedented, oh, this is unprecedented, but there have been monumental decisions that that have been issued from this term she got there, and ever since. And I would love to know, similar to Kristen's question, in bearing witness to that, how has that changed her at all, or has it?
Wow.
Because it's hard to imagine that it. I don't even know if I have a prediction as to what that answer could be, but I think having she's someone who really thinks a lot about context, as your opening quote from her book shows, and I know these are the type of questions she grapples with. Or is it too much? Maybe they're not right now. Maybe that has to be compartmentalized in order for her to be the public servant she is.
And even if we have like a conception of like how the depth to which it could change somebody, you know what I mean? Because like we're not situated like she is, like I don't know. It's just mind-boggling.
Right.
And I think a reason why, I'm also having a gut reaction to this question is I remember I was at the National Book Festival last week or 2 weeks ago. And as I was speaking with some authors, it can be overwhelming to see that many people in one, sitting, and everyone wants an autograph and everyone wants to do this and stuff like that. And I remember, when I would get to the autograph table, I would always tell each author, like, I hope you're okay. Like, I know this can be very overwhelming, and people are just taking from you in this moment, but I hope you yourself that you're okay, and that you can find rest after something like this. And I think especially when you're a public servant, so if we broaden this out to how much Black women have been in a position of servitude, whether it's public service, whether historically it's been working in people's homes and things of that sort, it's like the focus is never really on them. It's just on their labor and what they can do for other people. So when you take a step back and say, how are you actually doing? You know what I mean? Right? It's almost like that's why I had a gut reaction, because it's like, oh man, like people rarely ask us, like, how are you doing yourself?
Including ourselves,
including ourselves,
yeah.
The whole country can feel like it's on your back, especially like you said, in these unprecedented times. And speaking of unprecedented times, this is our last question. So we're officially in election season, and part of the desire to create this podcast and get people thinking more historically, especially in this moment that we're living in, what is one issue that you feel like should be at the top of people's minds as they're at the election polls, or filling in their mail-in ballot? What's one issue that you feel like should be at the top of people's minds? You're like, all of them.
One issue, I feel like the civic scholar among us has to take this question.
Oh, wow. Says the woman who I'm unsure that I have yet to hear a book title.
That's true.
I know, put in the show notes after.
Okay, I'm just like not pointing any fingers. I just pointing. Exactly. So what's the main issue? What are some of the issues that I think people should be thinking about as they head to the polls in November? I mean, there are so many. I obviously am coming out of an organization that focused heavily on reproductive rights. And that is a crucial issue. in terms of making sure that, you know, people have access to the spectrum of healthcare that is necessary for us to have a healthy society, and like the way in which that is not singularly a woman's issue.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's for childbearing people. It is for men who then end up being single parents because, you know, lack maternal health or whatever the case may be, you know. And so I think that it is almost like a wraparound societal issue that oftentimes gets overly and improperly stigmatized and assigned just to women or childbearing people. Like, I don't like, it is all of us. So that's that. And obviously I would say access to just voting rights, access to the polls is huge.
Yeah.
You know, climate change, but then also, honestly, I would say it's the down ballot stuff. It is the state and local, those state and local elections, those state and local candidates, those state and local conversations are actually where our focus needs to be. And I think that as we move out of, you know, this kind of post-Trumpian era, thinking about like, yes, like this is monumental what we're about to do or attempt to do in November. But obviously, I also want us to think about like what happens then in terms of like going to midterms and going to our next cycle. I just don't want to see us in this situation again. And so I think I want us to think about how it is that we are actually voting our values. But before we can vote our values, we also have to live them. And I think that like, I hope people see themselves as change makers beyond just the ballot. The ballot is a huge way that you can illustrate that. But I hope that people feel like they can see themselves as the decider of so many things in their own lives on a day-to-day basis, and that start translating into expecting more out of our society, because I think we do have the power to build a society and a world that's worthy of us. And I think that for a long time we felt like we had to abide by the limitations of what this current system can do. And I think that we have actually an opportunity to start welding a much more expansive, compassionate world by virtue of just us demanding it and having more language for it. And so I think that's also something to keep in mind, is that like November is important, but also like if we could paint on this canvas, like what would we want to paint?
Yes. Oh, Kristin, I really love that. And I think it's like exactly right. November is important. And I would also heavily echo the stuff about down ballot and local, so many things. And, you know, I remember I was getting a ballot when I lived in DC mailed to me, and and having to just do so much Googling and what's an ANC, and, you know, and you really, then you realize, you look it up and you realize it's like actually kind of important. And, and so I think that oh, this has always stuck with me. But I also think Kristen's last point about demands is so important. It's like, is thinking about what is really your expectation beyond election day and before election day, and how are you gonna be involved or participate in a way that asks for those things, and beyond November, and what kind of power and how can you harness power in communities or in organizing that insist on more, just be, you know, other than just like kind of the gesture of submitting a ballot, but not, you know, the things that have to come after that are really critical to improving people's lives and reducing suffering.
So good. So many issues. And I think that's something that I've also been emphasizing to everyone that will listen, is that, you know, there are amazing resources like Ballot Ready that helps people, for example, preview their ballot and the issues and the people that will be on it, whether it's, you know, from the presidential election all the way down to your local school board election, and just making sure that people are as informed as possible. Because I think, you know, we can't ignore the history that's behind a lot of the things that are under attack right now. And most of that's rooted in voting rights. You know what I mean? People literally died for us to have the right to vote. And the least we can do is be informed voters. Well, we are bringing this podcast episode to a close. Thank you so much, Kristin and Imelme. This has been a phenomenal conversation. You know, like I said earlier, one thing I love about Black Harvard women is that we know how to show up for each other, especially for a last minute event like this. But yeah, I'm so happy that we had time to talk about Ketanji Brown Jackson's new memoir, a lovely one, published by Penguin Random House. Wherever you get books, trust me, it is there. Support Black women authors. It's so important. Like I said, the whole principle and mission behind this podcast and a lot of my public scholarship is making sure that Black women are no longer treated as the footnotes throughout history. And part of that is realizing that you do not have to be a Black woman to enjoy the intellectual contributions of Black women. So I'm so excited. And thank you everyone for tuning into 100 Historic Black Women You Should Know by Election Day. Be sure to follow the podcast on YouTube and on Spotify. And yes, that is a round.